Welcome back. We're talking about the crisis in Syria. Joining us from Moscow is international affairs analyst Mark Sleboda. With us here in Washington is former Pentagon spokesman J.D. Gordon. And joining us from London is Syrian military analyst Kamal Alam. Kamal, let me go back to you. We just heard J.D. raise the issue of the possible overthrow of Bashar al-Assad. Is that the problem with all the international efforts being made to resolve this crisis in Syria? On the one hand, you have the United States, which is talking about regime change. And on the other hand, we have Russia, which says, no, this is not about regime change. This is about ending a civil war.
I think so. The big problem that the West has dug itself in is personalizing this conflict. They've put everything, or the whole conflict, into one man, as if Bashar al-Assad is responsible for everything that's going wrong in Syria. You keep hearing that ISIL has come because of Bashar al-Assad. Well, there's ISIL all over the Middle East now, in Libya, in Egypt, in Yemen, in Saudi Arabia. Bashar al-Assad is not everywhere, you know, he's not Superman. So I think the demonization of one man, this is about Syria as a country, it's about the institutions. And the most important thing is that when President Obama talks about a pluralistic Syria that includes everyone, that's already the Syrian government and the Syrian army. One can argue it's never been perfect, and the legitimate demands of the Syrian people were there 4 years ago, but those legitimate demands were hijacked very quickly by extremists. And that's what's happened in Syria. You already have a pluralistic state there, and to have this idea that there'll be an overnight democracy, it just doesn't exist anywhere in the region, especially in the Arab world. So that's not going to happen. And it's not about Assad. It's about Syria. The Syrian army is fighting against terrorists that are acting against the state. And as I said, most of the power centers of Syria are still with the government. The majority of the urban Sunnis support him. And even the Jordanians and the Saudis, they reached out to the Sunni Tribal Alliance in Syria. And the Tribal Alliance of Sunnis in Syria rejected the offer from Jordan and Saudi Arabia because they said, we'd rather be Syrians than join any kind of sectarian war being imposed by the Saudis or some other countries.
Mark, the Russians have now entered this conflict. How does that change the situation, not just on the battlefield, but politically for Bashar al-Assad as well?
Well, I believe that the Russian government intervened when it did, when it was felt it absolutely had to. First and foremost is for reasons of its own national security, as ISIS has declared part of southern Russia to be territory that it should own by right, and ISIS-franchised groups have already attempted terrorist attacks in southern Russia. Most of them have been thwarted, thank God. But Russia is well aware that an ISIS or an Al-Qaeda or whatever 31 flavors of jihad you want to come up with that would result from a fall of the Syrian government in Damascus would be a direct threat to the Russian national security and the Russian people. It would also be a threat to the world, the Islamic world, stretching from Afghanistan all the way to Libya and Algeria. But Russia intervened when it did, I believe, because the U.S. was about to instigate an overt regime change policy, a Libya-style operation, starting with a euphemism of safe havens for militants along the Turkish border. This would have been done in coordination with Turkey and with Saudi Arabia. And JD's favorite talking point is try to present this as an Alawite, a Shia-Sunni conflict that the U.S. isn't involved in, as if Saudi Arabia isn't actually a client state that Obama has sold over $16 billion of fighter jets in 1 year, and as if U.S. TOW missiles aren't going straight from the U.S. into Saudi hands and then into the hands of these proxies, including Al-Qaeda. Personally, I think Obama should have to get down on his hands and knees before the victims, the families of the victims of 9/11 and the families of the military people. I'm a military vet myself who fought against Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and in Iraq, and explain to them why their tax dollars are going to pay the salaries, training, and weapons of groups that are fighting alongside and under the military command, according to the New York Times, of Al-Qaeda. I think Obama has taken the U.S. and the U.S. people into a very, very dark place in his obsession for regime change in Syria.
JD, was the hand of the President Obama, forced in some way, you know, by announcing this decision to send advisors, more advisors, 50 more advisors to Syria, by the fact that Russia has intervened now?
Oh, absolutely. He had a lot of pressure because of what Vladimir Putin's doing, but I think we're hearing a significant amount of Russian propaganda right now. I think if you talk about weapon sales, look, Syria
U.S.
is going to...
military vet, JD. U.S. military vet, JD.
Okay, fine.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Syria buys billions of dollars in Russian weapons, and also Syria is the host to Tartus Naval Base, which is Russia's only base outside of the former Soviet Union. So Vladimir Putin sees it in his national interest to prop up Bashar al-Assad, his key ally there, who's been his key ally for quite some time, and even before Bashar, Hafez al-Assad for decades was Russia's top ally there. So by Russia propping up Bashar al-Assad, the civil war is going to keep going on. Look, 250,000 people have been killed. 4 million Syrians have left the country, with so many going into Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Europe. And the longer Vladimir Putin props up Bashar al-Assad, the longer it's going to last. And there was another comment, too, about, well, you know, Bashar al-Assad is just fighting terrorists. Well, actually, no. During the 2011 Arab Spring, those protests in Daraa were peaceful. What did Bashar al-Assad do? He sent out tanks against them. Now remember, his dad, Hafez, killed 25,000, mostly Sunnis, mostly from the Muslim Brotherhood in Hama, 25,000. So I think that Bashar al-Assad has increased that by tenfold. So he's a dictator. I think he has to go. There's no way you're going to be able to get Bashar al-Assad together with the rest of the Syrian people when he's killed so many, and his Alawite cronies have killed so many as well.
And that is the United States view, that he has to go. Kamal, we now have a new international effort at trying to resolve this international conference, the first session held in Vienna. Do you see hope there? I mean, what will ultimately come out of this?
Well, I think the biggest change is that the Saudis have publicly said that they can live with Assad for the time being. And basically, that's a Saudi admission saying that they failed. Their main objective was to get rid of Assad, and they failed in that. And I think the big change that's come in the current talks is that at the moment, they're not talking about Assad going. Now, what happens in the future, we don't know. So I think there is a glimmer of hope. It's obviously not going to be easy on the ground, but the main problem is that unless the fighting stops and there's some kind of long-term ceasefire on the ground, I don't see any of the talks working, because at the end of the day, you've got a very porous border from Iraq, a very porous border from Turkey and Jordan, and unless those borders are plugged, this war is not going to stop. But there is a political will now. I think a lot of Gulf countries, including Oman, the United Arab Emirates, they've realized that Assad has to stay. And I think it's important here to mention, especially Oman and the UAE, they've told the Saudis, look, Assad's not going anywhere, whether you like it or not. And you've tried, you've thrown all your weapons, you've thrown all your money at it. He's still there. So let's talk now. And I think that's where the rationale has to come in, that whether you like him, whether you hate him, like I said, it's a demonization. And JD might be right in some of the points he's talking about. But I think, as I said, Assad is not a Superman, and the more you talk about him as if, you know, it's not about him, it's about Syria, it's about the institutions. And almost everyone in NATO right now believes that the Syrian Arab army must remain intact. It's the only pluralistic fighting force on the ground, and it must be supported.
Okay, and that's where we are going to have to leave it. Gentlemen, thanks to all of you for joining us.